Hello, everyone. This is Professor Hamamoto. It is June 2nd, year 2022. It is 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. I trust you're all doing fantastically well. We're moving into the midpoint of year 2022. Yikes. Wow. The year's going by very, very quickly. I don't know if that's a good sign or a bad sign. I don't know. We're making progress, though. That's what I do know. That's a definite positive. So I hope you're doing well, as I said, and we're going to be digging a little bit deeper into the wacky but prescient world of one Hugo Gernsback, or Ugo Gernsback, because he was a native German speaker from Luxembourg, the empire there, or the kingdom, which and I mentioned that not just in passing. I think it's really important to understand it's important to understand origins in general, bloodlines, as I sometimes call it. And it's not really emphasized very much in the literature that I've read about science fiction about Ugo Gernsback, or I'll call him Hugo. By the way, the science fiction award, like they have the Academy Awards, and the recording industry has their Grammys, or the movie business has the Oscars, the Academy Awards. Well, the award, the highest accolade you can get is in science fiction is called the Hugo Award, which is named after, of course, Hugo Gernsback. But he's more than an award. He's more than just a passing name. I think he's foundational as an American intellectual, right? And I say that because oft times, and I think typically, even in this really fantastic book here, Astounding, which I cited last time, it's by Alec Navala Lee. It would be great to have him on the show to find out how I know he's a writer and he writes in the SF area, but I just wanted to find out how he decided to commit so much time and energy in putting together such a wonderful book. Now, that being said, I do just differ with his conclusions. I kind of skipped ahead, and I'm going to have to read it through the book over the weekend a little bit more carefully. So I might be misrepresenting his views here, but I get the impression from reading Mr. Alec Navala Lee that the efforts of John W. Campbell Jr., who was the editor of all those great Golden Age science fiction magazines, he preferred to call it speculative fiction. And we're talking about the Golden Age, roughly 1938, right between the wars, right before World War II, 1938 to 1946, 47, around there, around the time that the United Nations was getting off the ground there. And so we're in a new era here. We're under United Nations tyranny. And some of that was foretold in a lot of this fiction here. But for the most part, it was viewed as world government was viewed as something that we should be careful and wary about. But it's something that's inevitable, and that's one of the reasons why science fiction has always been subsidized behind the scenes, and probably more overtly today through the various institutions, writing workshops, the publishers, of course, which are Pentagon owned, which means NATO owned, the banker owned, right? But they're the people of the Golden Age, including the editor, John Campbell, right? Isaac Asimov, who we've talked about already, Robert Heinlein, right? L. Ron Hubbard, who we're going to talk about more in depth today. Some of you may think, okay, I already know about Scientology, Jack Parsons, blah, blah, blah. He wouldn't see it. Okay, I have some more info for you here, original insights, I think that you'll want to stay tuned for. So again, don't shut off or shut down or shut out prematurely here, because I'm trying some radically new connections. And as to finish my thought about this great book, Astounding, by Alec Navala Lee, to finish that out, he seems to indicate that the efforts of these gentlemen kind of petered out and weren't really had much of a long-term impact. And if I'm representing his conclusion accurately, or at least close to accurately, then I would have to differ with that, because my argument is that They are probably the most successful literary cultural movement in modern times. And I only came to that realization in working through this material in real time, along with you, sharing my conclusions. And I think I'm going to stick with that conclusion. I doubt, from what I've read so far, if anything, if nothing else, my argument that this was the most important literary movement in modern times is probably going to be strengthened. But unless we're attuned to it in that fashion, that's where my contribution is important. I'm pointing certain elements that don't have the salience at this point yet. So people are not really viewing science fiction in a proper manner. And I told you in the previous talk here, I myself was was myopic. I was really short-sighted about the implication of science fiction. A lot of it had to do with my own personal encounter with anti-Japanese, specifically anti-Asian racism that I was being bombarded with through this fiction and the television and the movies. Right, even today, the ETs look kind of Asian to me. Right, Douglas Dietrich's book on ETs. He even claims that what they were called ETs, right, these people that crashed at Roswell, were not figuratively speaking or imaginatively speaking, that they were Japanese. They were dwarf Japanese people that were recovered over in Roswell. Okay, that book in itself probably deserves an entire talk, but I'm just invoking it to tell you my own encounter with science fiction was not a happy one. I mean, if let's say if you're an African American person, right? Are you going to watch movies or science fiction where you're portrayed consistently as someone who wants to destroy the world and take over and rule over everybody else? No, I don't think so. Right? I don't think that any normal person is that masochistic. But I had to read it too. I had to read Fahrenheit 451 and Brave New World, all the canonical texts in junior high school, and I enjoyed them to a certain degree. But I was never a science fiction junkie or a nerd out, if you want to call it that, right? As all these writers were when they started. So who was their influence? They meaning Asimov, Heinlein, Hubbard, and others, right? There's L. Sprague de Camp or Sprague de Camp, people like that. Robert Silverberg's a little bit younger. There's a whole coterie there. I don't need to go into them, right? But I'm just giving you some of the main people that keep popping up over and over again, including in this incredible book here. And I claim that they were successful. And if I have time, I'll be more specific about my claim, or I'll leave it for next Tuesday. Because guess what, ladies and gentlemen? Let me just say it very quickly in case I don't ever get to it. The work that these gentlemen did is now mainstream in the field of political sociology or social psychology, but more specifically, political sociology, right? And I'll give you one concrete example, a specific example that most of you will be able to understand because you know this figure out there who's been on the Alex Jones show for many years. He hasn't shown his ugly face in many, many months. I mean, he had the chutzpah to show up after he said that Donald Trump was going to get reelected and all these miscreants are going to be rolled up, right? He was giving us the basic QAnon line. Do you know who I'm talking about? Yes, Dr. Steve Putschenek. That's Pichenik. I call him Putschenek. And by the way, I don't even buy his legend that he was born somewhere else, raised in Cuba. He has his accent's that of a Brooklyn Jew. I hear no trace of Spanish. Maybe he does speak Espanol, and he's a spook after all. But the reason I'm picking on him is because remember in watching him on the Alex Jones show how he used to brag about taking down different governments by profiling them and studying political sociology and political social psychology at where was it, at Harvard, when he was getting his medical degree. And I mean, he had all these bona fides. So that's one example of one person who was doing it, right? But when you're talking about the resource of entire agencies, not just the civilian ones like CIA, FBI, but even more importantly, perhaps the Office of Naval Intelligence, devoted to taking down nations by profiling them and creating these scenarios that are drawn directly from science fiction, not just theory, but methodology, right? The narrative and the scenario making, or today it's called world making. Then you see it had just this one trivial example of Dr. Steve Pachenik, right? The great, he's, he was so full of himself. It's really hard. It was hard to stomach him, but I'd like to look at him like a little specimen in a bell jar and give him give him enough rope to hang himself. With people working supposedly on the behalf of the American public, we don't really need enemies, right? He's just one of the another example of creeps that are produced by these elite institutions that think they run the world and us in it. But they're so wrong, because you know what? We have countermeasures, right? It's not a one-way street, Dr. Pachenik. If you can mind fuck the public or whoever else that you're going in on, the reverse can be true, right? So be forewarned, all you academic, whatever anthropologists or social science, behavioral scientists or cognitive psychologists who think you've got us under wraps. You are so wrong. So today I'm going to talk about Hugo Gernsback, who is really the granddaddy of all this. And as I alluded to earlier, he comes from the Kingdom of Luxembourg. I guess, this is before the United Nations, but it did have sovereign status as a nation, even though historically it has changed hands between one principality and another. But the time he was born, I think he was born in 1904. He's an early child of the 20th century. I mean, he followed it almost, and he lived a really long life. I think he lived till like 1988 or something, or 90, something like that. And he saw all the changes that he was talking about. And it wasn't so much that he was prescient. It was because he was a student of technology. He read the papers, and including this is very important, including the academic papers. If nothing else, that I would like to communicate with you today, ladies and gentlemen, is that the relationship between academic research and science fiction and all the arts is that close. And that's not something that we typically hear. And even Mr. Alec Naval-Ali doesn't really understand the full implications of that. I do, because that's my world. And I'm not just talking about the fact that Albert Einstein was a subscriber to Hugo Gernsback's amazing stories, right? I'm not just talking about the fact that these econometric specialists, these commentators, or even social planners were reading Isaac Asimov when they were teenagers, age 10 to 12, when they really start forming their core ideas and their missions. And I'm not just talking about an influence. I'm talking about the research, the primary research that's later put out into the larger audience via the literature. And again, don't confuse this with so-called predictive programming. I have nothing but respect for David Icke, and I'm not mocking that phrase, but it goes much deeper than that. It's a different approach that I am bringing to the understanding of Hugo Gernsback. So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome again. We're halfway through the year. I want to thank you. I want to just take a moment to thank all the people in the live stream, and also the people who watch the recorded show regularly. The 9,000 subscribers, moving on 10,000. I should have 10 million subscribers, but I value all 9,000 of you, right? That's 9,000 more people than I ever would have reached in my lifetime otherwise, right? And it's coming through one of the great forecast of televisuality, screen culture, YouTube, right? And Hugo Gernsback was there, right? And also, yeah, I'm getting more people supporting me on Patreon. I'm very grateful to you on that. It allows me to buy books like this. I can't wait till they get into paperback, and the hardback editions are more expensive. That's what I used to do to save money. But that your contributions help me to gather these valuable resources that I can, return back to you in the form of a value added product, if you want to put it in merchandising terms, right? So let me start with a graphic that I prepared for you. Very serious gentlemen. All these guys were serious. They had their fun. And by the way, if I have time, I'm going to talk about their sexual adventurism because, after all, the title of this talk is Orgasm Rationing Coming Soon. That's not just clickbait here. Right? You thought that taxation by the mile was something that was never going to happen, right? You thought that, we can pile example upon example. So don't be surprised when you heard it first. I think that there's gonna be orgasm rationing. In fact, some people will be denied orgasms altogether, whereas some people will be permitted unlimited amount of those, right? And my foresee, because you don't have to be a science fiction writer to do forecasting, right? I'll do forecasting. My prediction, since we're not going to be able to drive anymore, we're going to sit around YouTube watching Jay Leno drive around in his automobile collection. We're not going to be able to see live music or even play anymore. So you're going to have to watch these channels of 1 million subscribers of other people with their vintage guitars and playing music while we're just kind of sitting there. Well, the same thing's happening to sexualized becoming a spectatorial activity or spectator sport, if you will. So my prediction is that since there are not going to be any more automobiles on the road, all the Goodyear service stations and the gas stations are going to be they're going to have to be repurposed. And my prediction is that all the tire stores, right, especially the ones called Big O, right, all the Big O tire stores are going to be repurposed for civilian processing centers for you and me to go in there to cash in our socials credit score credits so that we will be permitted X number of Big O's for that month, right? Big O, big orgasm. You thought it meant tire, but I think it means orgasm. So there you go. Pardon me, I'm just having a little bit fun with I'm not as serious as this guy is as serious as a heart attack. This is none other than Mr. Hugo Gernsback, or Hugo Gernsback. Very serious man of letters, arts and letters and science. And I might be wrong, and I don't mind being corrected on this, but if there is a full length biography about or on Hugo Gernsback, I would appreciate being informed of it. If that hasn't happened yet, it should. And by the way, it's possible that Gernsback is considered, and it's not a name that you might not have even heard of before today. If you're a science fiction person, maybe you have. But just to give you an idea how seriously Gernsback is taken, his papers are part of the holdings, the private collection at Syracuse University. I found it. So if you're a scholar, I don't think they'll let anybody just kind of walk off the street and look through his papers. You have to have some sort of bona fides. I don't think you need a license, but if you have a doctorate in history or literature, something like that, a good cover story, you can make an appointment. And you'll be told to leave all your pencils and pens outside. And they're very, thankfully, I've been to these archives. And like the British archives, if you want to bring stuff in and you put it in a plastic, it's like a purse, a zipper, so they can see what's in there. So they can tell whether you're stealing anything or not. But anyway, it's under security, and don't be surprised if you start seeing some of these archives kind of disappear, if not being sabotaged. But there's the Gernsback papers there for you. Anybody who's interested in writing a biography or a research paper on him. I have a lot of questions myself about him and his connection to the royal house of Luxembourg, especially the royal duchess, who, by the way, was acquainted with John F. Kennedy. I have a photo of them together. And and the important part, of course, is that house, the royal house of Luxembourg, is of the house of Orange. Okay, you know about Orange, Nassau, and all the different Saxe-Coburg, Gotha. The lineage, the royal lineage, is really important. That's the House of Orange. That's where I contend that Burgess, Anthony Burgess, right, and the Clockwork Orange, and you name it. What other books? I can't think of them offhand. He liked to think of him, and he was a critic, of course, a literary and then a social, cultural, political critic. I think that's where he got the title of the Clockwork Orange, right? The House of Orange, which is a banking and exploration and science based empire, right? Part of, I think, the larger Habsburgian Empire at one point. And the reason that why this is important is that it's no accident why people like Gernsback and then later Einstein and all the great scientists that came out of Central Europe, why they happen to come out of that particular area is because of the commitment on the part of the monarchy to subsidize science, right? And occult literature, by the way, as well, science and metaphysics and the occult at the same time, because they saw them as just like the classic British mage, people like John Dee and Francis Bacon, people from that background, they saw that being synonymous. So did Aleister Crowley in the 20th century, who we'll get back to in a moment, because Crowley plays a certain part in this network of individuals, especially when it comes to, as you know, L. Ron Hubbard, right? And this is in the pre-Scientology days. So that's Hugo Gernsback. Here is Hugo Gernsback in, I think, 1963 on the cover of Life magazine. That's Skull and Bones, right? It's a publication direct. If some people might not know it, I mean, we got it every month in my household. Life magazine was a fixture in our household. But for those of you who don't remember, don't know, it was a popular picture graphic oriented magazine for middle America, working class America, and it educated a lot of people, including myself, to the wider world. And here's a picture of Hugo Gernsback on the cover of Life magazine in 1963. Now, is that reminiscent or what of Mark Zuckerberg? You think Mark Zuckerberg came up with it? You know he's a front anyway. But you know the picture I'm talking about. But Hugo Gernsback was writing about this in the 20s, and in fact, I think in the early 30s, he was already doing experimentation with what we call television today. It was a very small screen. It was not a cathode ray screen, but the theory and the practical application of televisuality and, of course, radio, which I'll talk about in a moment, had already been worked out really early on in the game. So that's Hugo Gernsback, who most people do not appreciate. By the way, this should get you going. Hugo Gernsback and Nikola Tesla, right? Another Central European, Romanian, who comes out of that milieu. The monarchy spent. They say we're going to have to compete with Britain. We're going to have to compete with all these with France, with all these other empires. We're going to do it through science. So he was well acquainted with Tesla. I don't know if they were friends, but they knew each other socially. And I'll throw out some other names you might be familiar with. He published H.G. Wells, right? You know who he is, and you know about the connection with the Huxleys and socialism and the Fabian Society. So Gernsback is part of that. In fact, he's a senior member. He was hiring these people. He was bringing them to prominence, but we don't really understand or know or really recognize him for that. And there's more there, which I want to dig into. Gosh, I wish I could get it would be great to teach at Syracuse University for one semester in the winter, in the dead of winter, where I couldn't go anywhere else except to the library to go through the papers. I think within 10 weeks, I'd uncover some, because I'm looking for certain papers. It's not a willy-nilly deal. You have to have some sort of framework. I call it cultural forensics, so that you can maximize your time and you can focus in what you really think it's important. I'm interested in the occultic in the metaphysical elements in his papers, not the gadget stuff, right? Not to minimize it. I'm not really interested in radio tubes as such and modern electronics. This is one of his publications, Hugo Gernsback. I love the graphics and the typography and the design. It's just really classic from the 20s to the. I like everything about the 20s and 30s. The fashion, the music, the the architecture. If there was one era that I wish I was living in, it was probably the 1930s. But that's fantasy. So that's one of his publication. Quickly, another one is a radio news. Remember, I told you he was a pioneer in what we now know as television. Television itself is, for the most part, gone. Right? It's been replaced by the screen that we're communing through right now, right? The computer, right? The internet revolution. But he was doing radio. He was the publisher of this magazine. He wasn't the contributor, although he did write articles. He was the guy that was soliciting contributions from all the great minds, both amateurs as well as world historical figures like H.G. Wells, who was big even when he was alive, right? That's his publication, right? They're rating it as revolutionary. And I talked earlier about how when radio and electrification came to the rural South, it wasn't there just to spread a civilization. It was there to bring together the national empire, all the regions of the nations together through the form of entertainment and news, right? Radio. It did have some important, and it still does have important redeeming social functions and cultural functions. Grand Ole Opry, remember that, right? Giant, huge stations, WBAI, that might even cover the entire North American continent, right? He helped make this possible, Hugo Gernsback, and he made a good living at it as well. Him and his brother really ran the show. He was the commander, the publisher of it, and his brother did the accounting and the book work, and he was more, I guess you can call him, the business manager. And they're both well paid. They compensated themselves well, especially given that they were working through the Great Depression. Here's another one of the publications, right? And by the way, the other main reason why I'm showing these graphics here is because people like Asimov and Heinlein, and of course Campbell, who was a little bit older than both of them, were reading these publications. They were big Gernsback fans, but Gernsback was interested in gadgetry. People like Asimov and especially Campbell who was the editor, right, later became editor, kind of fortuitously. I won't go into how he became the editor of Amazing Stories and started cultivating people like a young Isaac Asimov. I think he met Asimov when Asimov was only 17 years old. I already told you he's precocious. He was a genius, like 160 IQ, and skipped a couple grades and was something like 16 years old as an undergraduate. Brilliant polymath and precocious talent all the way around. Well, he was just Asimov was. This is Campbell. Campbell saw Asimov as somebody that he could groom from a very young age to embody the agenda that Campbell thought was important. But I think that there was somebody behind Campbell, and I think there was somebody behind Hugo Gernsback. That's why I want to look at the papers, right? These guys are brilliant in their own right, but you can't put publications like this together. You can't build businesses. You cannot just, that's true then, it's true today, right? Elon Musk is a front person for someone else. Yeah, he's quirky, he's interesting, he's bright, he's intelligent, and there's certain admirable qualities about him. I don't trust him as far as I can throw him. I know all about Neuralink. He handed UC Davis a huge, almost $1 million contract, and that's only one institution. That's how they do it. They seed the money every place, and then you become dependent on them. I want to find out who was funding Gernsback. I think it was probably some royals back in Luxembourg or in Switzerland, perhaps. It might have been one of these historic banking families, right? And I haven't come across the references yet, but that's what I'm primed for when I'm looking at the papers. That's what I want you to look for when you hear the name Gernsback being uttered hereafter. Here's another. This is where we're getting to the science fiction. The other stuff was technology based radios, tubes, or in Britain they're called valves, telegraphy, television, right? The science, the hard science, applied science, and a little bit of theoretical science and physics. But this is where the fiction comes in. This is one of his main contributions to this. And one of the stories I read in Astounding by Alec Navalny is that Neil Gaiman, just to bring it back to some topicality for today, you may know Neil Gaiman as the guy that's a colleague of Alan Moore, who, by the way, is a Freemason by his own account and is considers himself a druid. He's the guy that wrote the graphic novel that became V for Vendetta. I don't know if he had any participation or input on the screenplay. An excellent film, and it's for what it is. But the reason I mention Neil Gaiman is that he bought a collection of amazing story. I think once he got his money together and became a famous author, he bought the original editions of Amazing Stories. But that's not the only part that I'm interested in. This is the only factoid that Alec Navalny picked up on. But I think it's much more interesting that Neil Gaiman, wait for it, grew up in a Scientology household. Yeah, he's a intellectual heir of L. Ron Hubbard, is Neil Gaiman. Right. If you don't know who he is, for those of you who do know, he's really prolific. He works in any number of genres: science fiction, fantasy, juvenile, adult. He's an essayist. He does a lot of graphic novels. I don't know, he's probably done screenplays. I don't doubt it. And he lives in the U.S. He's British born, but he lives somewhere in the Midwest. I can't remember where. But keep that in mind. Gaiman I don't think he ever left the church. He is a Scientologist. So you might think we're talking about some old guy who's long dead, back from the 20s and 30s, named Hugo Gernsback. No, I'm talking about 2022. The beat goes on, ladies and gentlemen, as Salvatore Bono once sang. We know him as Sonny Bono, as Sonny and Cher. The beat goes on. Okay, here we go, ladies and gentlemen. I told you about orgasm rationing, right? Here's where Gernsback turns a little kinky. I don't know what his personal sexual predilections were. I sure would like to find out, because I think people's sexuality tell a lot about who they are as human beings, but also as writers, as actors, as politicians, as whoever, as sports figures. Man, we all want to know about their sexual. Come on, let's be honest. I mean, that's what we watch TMZ for. We read the National Enquirer. We want to know who's zooming who, right? So Gernsback, and by the way, if we have time, we'll talk a little bit about the kinky sexuality of Robert Heinlein, of L. Ron Hubbard, right? John Campbell as well. Oh my gosh. That there should be volumes just on their own. Second, you could look at Sigmund Freud's sexuality and predict, in retrospect, of course, through psychohistory methods, through ex post facto explanation, right? If you look at his family background, you can almost predict why he wrote he spun these incredible theories that are fascinating as fiction. And he built a whole empire upon fiction. So don't dismiss science fiction. Don't dismiss don't dismiss the comic books, the graphic novel. Take them dead seriously, because they could be they're in the process of determining our current and future history. So here's I've been teasing you here. So here's the publication that Gernsback published. Didn't contribute. He published. I don't know if he conceived it, pardon the pun. I think he might have, but he had backing from somebody. This is why I follow the money, right? I want to know where Gernsback, because he was well educated, came from a good family. His family were wine makers, I believe. That's how he got into gadgets, because one of the master winemakers taught him how to build machinery to time the aging process of grapes. I don't know, something on those lines, but it became a lifelong fascination. But here's his publication. I want you to etch it into your mind. And by the way, I will tell you, I am the proud owner of one of the original copies of his publication called, yes, Sexology, appropriately enough. Look at the subtitle, The Magazine of Sex Science. Right. This is a revolutionary publication in English. And I say in English because they are already doing this in France and especially in Germany and Austria. And remember, Hugo Gernsback comes from Luxembourg and he went to school in Germany. So he was really, well, I don't know really, but he was at least aware of the currents of sexology, the study of human sexology in Berlin, which was the capital of the science of human sexuality. And the name Hans, is it Magnus Hirschfeld? Yeah, Magnus Hirschfeld, who was later closed down by his institute, was closed down by the Third Reich as being Jewish science, right? So I don't know what happened. I don't think he ever recovered from that. Freud split. He died a year later in London, but I think Hirschfeld got wrapped up in it. I don't think he was sent to the concentration camp, but his operation got closed down. By the way, psychiatry and psychology, the Third Reich, they kept it. They just got rid of the Jews who were involved with it, which was a substantial number of them were Jews, but they were Jews who had left the faith. Most of them were atheists, so they constructed a new synthetic faith called psychology and psychiatry. And guess where they went? They went either to London, and as I told you in previous talks, they came to New York, right? And that's where he was born in the U.S., but Dr. Greenfeld, right? The psychiatrist to Marilyn Monroe. He comes out of that background, so you can see the consistency, the historical consistency of these emigre waves, right? Operation Paperclip is not the only one, right? There are different waves. There's probably waves going. Not probably. I'm sure there are waves of Chinese intellectuals and scientists who are coming in right now, who are building a new infrastructure. Probably from people from Mexico. We're distracted from the working class immigrants that are coming from the U.S. Mexico border. I think that's part of the psyops, but also from Latin America are some brilliant people coming from Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico itself, right? The intellectual classes coming in and being housed at Stanford, Yale, and Syracuse. I'll just throw that in there. Cornell, right? You name it. Maybe even over UC Davis down here, Cowtown, right down the road here. So anyway, this is Hugo Gernsback Sexology. This, I think, is the original, the volume one, number one issue, 1933. It was cost a quarter. I don't know what that was back in those days, but it wasn't cheap because I think the comic books were maybe a nickel at the time. And it was probably, I would say this magazine is probably aimed at middle class, maybe at least high school educated, possibly university or college educated. You can't see the table of contents, but it's pretty high level material. It's not science research papers, but it's distillations or summaries of state of the art science. And a lot of the articles are written by MDs and PhDs as well. I think I have a copy someplace like that. Okay, now this is a counterexample for you, right? Counter my own claim that this was not just a genre innovation, science fiction, like detective fiction, right, is a genre. I say it's a literary, and I would go so far today saying it was a literary / political movement, right? Science fiction. And this helps to confirm it for me. This book, a full length book that I came across between Tuesday and today, published by, you can see a little watermark on the lower right-hand side in Springer. Do you remember the name Springer? That was that was the premier publishing company that Sir Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, that was his connection, Springer, that brought him to international prominence and personal wealth by getting all the Springer Verlag science articles that were done under the Third Reich and then exfiltrate them to America, London, to Tokyo, right? He was doing that was an intelligence operation, made him rich. That's the same publisher, and they're still in existence in 2022, and they dominate science publishing today in 2022. See all the historical continuities we got going here, ladies and gentlemen? Oh, isn't it exciting? It's better than read for me. I get it's aesthetically pleasing to weave together all these threads and to present them into semi-comprehensible form to you. It'll be absolutely comprehensible if I can ever find the time to put it down in book form. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm not doing a bad job doing this on the fly, right? Improvising, if you will. Not willy-nilly, it's structured improvisation. I got all the chord changes memorized in my head. I got the head, I got the melody, right? But all these other elements I bring to you spontaneously. So this is a Springer. It's not called Springer Verlag anymore. By the way, Springer, do I have to tell you that they had to go through a vetting process after World War II by the British and American and Soviet authorities to see how close Axel Springer was to the Third Reich. And they were, of course, whitewashed. And, as you know, 70% of the people who were indicted or tried at Nuremberg, they skated, right? If they could skate out in Nuremberg, don't be so angry that this attorney for the Clinton Foundation, Sussman, also skated recently, right? Because that's just the way it works. Well, we got our own form. We're getting justice right now. It's called smut justice, right? And that's my particular technique. We smear these people with dirt and they lose credibility and legitimacy and they start falling of their own accord. All right. Just be patient, but don't depend on these corrupt institutions to get any sort of justice. So look at the title itself. What does it say? This is a repudiation of the whole Gernsbackian revolution. This person, Andrew May, I didn't really look at his bona fides, but probably some academic someplace. I don't know, but I'll find out. I only recently found this book. But at the title, Pseudoscience, is that a loaded term or what? Pseudoscience and science fiction. And look at the little spaceship, right? Oh, yeah, we're all going to fly away. We're all gonna the Space Brothers gonna come down here. We're all gonna put our little tinfoil hats, and they're gonna take some, and we leave ourselves open to that sort of denigration when we indiscriminately accept the contributions of people like this, Michael Sell. I know I'm going to alienate people. I don't trust the guy or Space Force, and he's another one of the U.S. Navy secret space. I'm not saying these programs don't exist, but what I am cautioning about is all the debris that's being thrown at us at once that pretends to be definitive accounts for what's really going down. And part of the problem that we're dealing with is the overload within the so-called independent news, the so-called citizen scholar that have cropped up, the citizen journalist, who aren't really doing their research. They're doing their Googling, yes. And Salah has very little of original material. He's recycling material and he's recrafting it in a narrative that he knows is going to have a huge audience. And you see, I buy the books, I read them, but that doesn't mean I'm going to accept them. I'm going back. That's why one of the reasons why I'm going back to Gernsback, and I'm going back to the granddaddies of the golden age of science fiction. Now, for every one of Michael Sal's, you need to be reading people like Jocelyn Godwin, not because he was a scholar. I think he's gone now, but he looks at the same body of literature as I'm just using Michael Sala as a placeholder for a whole range of people. What's his name? The guy that said, trust the plan, Q, the cabal, what is it called? David, not David Icke, the other guy. I can't remember. I watch them and I don't follow them. I'm not devoted to them. I'm not a cult member, but those people take the oxygen away from people like Jocelyn Godwin, who takes the whole polar myth, the hollow earth theory, Nazi German technology, UFO, Arctos. He takes it seriously and goes through it all. And it's much more fulfilling. And by the way, to show that you don't have to be with a major university, right? This is Adventures Unlimited. This is not an academic press. And I need to get David Childress on this show. He's the publisher of Adventures Unlimited. He's also an author. This is an incredibly well-researched book. It's How Nebu, The Secret File. I can recommend this book without qualification. David Hatcher Childress, The Secret, Greatest UFO Secret. No, the titles are sensationalistic, right? But go to the material and see the citations, and you'll be dazzled. This is an even better book than that because he cites Henry Stevens in this particular book. But so I went to the source. This is called Hitler's Flying Saucers, right? And again, forget about the sensationalistic title. It's misleading, all right? But I'm pointing this out to you because these guys are misleading us, misleading the audience, right? Saying, don't look there, look to us. We have the solutions. And as I told you before, their solutions are codified in social psychology, political sociology, political psychology as well, as represented by people like the hero in his own mind, the legend in his own mind, Dr. Stephen Pajanek. One of the greatest psyops put on the American people for the last 2 or 3 years, all the way through the Trump administration. That's Dr. Steve Pajanek. Okay, so let me finish up here with a little bit of an excursion into teledildonics. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's here. It is the future is with us. Orgasm, rationing, coming soon. Probably as close as your app. Your smartphone, that's what's going to be the device to where you can get the big O or not. Okay, watch this little presentation at a conference. I think it was 2018. It's fairly recent.
Technology that drives these things has been around for a while. You guys have been some of the few people actually moving into this space. What do you think that's about?
Well, we wanted to bring this, in my opinion, third dimension to the internet. For a while, you can see each other online, you can hear each other online, but you cannot feel each other online. Oh My Bot started with that already 8 years ago, around that. And we wanted to bring it to the next level. So we created sort of you can see it as an operating system. Google kind of an Android kind of operating system. What we didn't want to keep that only for ourselves, but to share that with the best companies out there. And in our opinion, OmaBot is one of the best female toy companies out there. Flashlight, the best male toy company out there. And we shared our technology, and we created together awesome interactive sex toys. Virtual reality makes the content so real that your brains, they want to have the confirmation that what you see, that it's real, and with feeling the same movement completely in sync gives you that feeling.
So if one day Google or Amazon sort of thawed their feelings towards sex devices, would you consider putting Google Assistant in a vibrator?
We've actually been talking about that.
Alexa, turn up my vibe.
Right?
Yeah, no buttons. Look, Mom, no buttons.
I can't imagine
Let's leave
better.
Mom out of this.
I can't imagine a better use case.
Bad analogy.
I certainly don't want to think about my mom, but I'm not one to judge. So what is next for Oh My Bod? You guys got anything you can reveal?
We can't tell you.
Of course.
We one of the things that we're doing actually is a couple of years ago here, we launched our Bluetooth-enabled Vibe line called Blue Motion, and that product has an app. And we're just basically revving that app. So we did a complete brand new overhaul to the app and the user interface and its functionality. And so that's kind of what we have going on in Q1 of this year. We're really, really excited about that.
I think most of the stuff we're working on is app kind of geared, right? All of our products are now connected. Now it's about user interface, how easy is it to use. Like in the new app that we just created, you can swipe.
Okay, there you go. See, I wasn't joking when I said it's going to be app-based. And what are apps going to be connected to? The social credit score. So your ability to have the big O, and I'm not meaning the big O tire stores, but the big O, right? Where these kinky science fiction writers were getting it left and right. They were totally kinky. They were into the big O. In fact, I think a lot of their fiction is little more than their own repressed sexuality put out there for entertainment purposes. But yeah, these are people who have products on the market already that have fused with the personal communication devices, cell phones, smartphones, that as they're called today, and they are going to be part of the oppressive system of social control, and it's going to be done. Well, there are many avenues, but one of the chief avenues that this takeover is going to be affected is in sexuality. And the problem is that everything that we see in the independent news is dealing only with transgenderism. It's only dealing with gender identity. And that itself is, well, it is a psyop, but that's a one-sided bait for people who are, let's say, your Sebastian Gorkas or your Ben Shapiro or some of these other characters that have been brought to. That is their talking point to distract us from this larger transition away from humanity, not just sexuality itself, but the humanity, and also the JLBTQ agenda, which we incessantly hear about, not just in the schools and the usual suspects, but also from the independent media. That's why I don't talk about that much, because it's not just because it's redundant, because I think overall it's intended to be a distraction. I'm more interested in what the big boys are saying about obscure figures, seemingly obscure figures like Hugo Gernsback. All right. Reinforced so far as these important figures of the science fiction golden age. Okay, let me finish up then with the few minutes I have left with a little bit of the anecdotes that I was able to glean from this incredible book, astounding so far as the sexuality of these individuals. I was not surprised, but I never had read it anywhere else, that Robert Heinlein was quite attractive to women, especially when he was in his naval. He was a product of the U.S. Naval Academy, right? So he wore his dress whites or his service uniform, traveling on trains or in taxi cabs, public transportation, and he would meet women on train and almost immediately get into the upper tier with them and have sex with them. In fact, one such woman was on the way to meet. She was to meet her fiance. She was about ready to get married when he had sex with this woman. This was in 1938 or 39. I mean, you think that this is pre-sexual liberation times. When I'm reading this book here, all these guys, these science fiction people in particular, including Isaac Asimov, were having all sorts of extramarital, non-marital, paramarital sex, multiple sex orgies, and you name it. It's like, it's mind-boggling and fascinating to no end. Heinlein himself was cuckolded by I think he was married 3 or 4 times, by one of his wives. Just before she married him, she had sex with one of his friends. And later they all became what's called a happy family. They all became part of a happy family. I guess it was like a communal marriage, we'd call it today. And then moving over to a more familiar story of Jack Parsons, right? This particular book gives a more detailed account of his home. I thought it was a one-story Pasadena bungalow, 1930s vintage house, but indeed, The Parsons home was a 3-story mansion, so he could house a lot of people there, visitors, and he could also hold orgies in one room while other people were sleeping or in the second or third floor carrying on their lives or whatever else they were doing. This is in Pasadena, which historically has been seen as a really staid and conservative community. And of course, Pasadena is the home to what later became the JPL, the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. And Pasadena is also home to the California Institute of Technology, Caltech, right? So that's what we're talking about in Southern California. Anyway, Jack Parsons, as you know, his wife ran off with L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard came over to the Pasadena mansion to spend some time. They're all part of the same network at some point. And he was going through some sort of depression writer's block, and he was trying to work out how what later became Scientology, how that was going to be packaged and put together. So while he was doing that, he was participating in all this incredible sex. What would you call? I guess they would call it swinging today. Sex, changing sex partners, group sex, serial monogamy or paramonogamy. You name it. I mean, he would astound Alfred Kinsey. And by the way, over in Indiana, University of Indiana, Kinsey was there was a revolution going on through the entire country. Kinsey was doing similar types of academic research, not just fiction, academic research at the University of Indiana, having sex orgies with his graduate researchers, his wife, their friends, and his colleagues. Some select professors, probably some deans, and maybe even the university president. And I suspect that this goes on quite often today at all these institutions, right? And I've heard stories, where places where I worked or visited, and I'll tell you, I was never invited to one of the mansion parties, and I think I know why. It's because they knew that I would probably be sitting in the corner with my notebook, writing down what I was observing, so that I can put it in a YouTube. This is before YouTube, of course. They never trusted me because they could see that I was an observer and a little bit too analytical to for their own level of comfort. I think that's the reason why they would test me out, and then realize, no, this guy is definitely a liability. So we got Jack Parsons there, and Parsons, of course, was connected to OTO, and you know about Aleister Crowley's sexuality. Crowley himself apparently viewed Parsons as a lightweight, and he viewed all these other characters as dabblers. He didn't really take them that seriously. He felt that his whole Thelema project was the real heir to this occult tradition that goes back to the pagan era in the British Isles, and even before that to the Babylonians, right? So he viewed these people as not too serious. However, it doesn't matter what Crowley thought about them. They took themselves dead seriously, especially L. Ron Hubbard. And as you know, and there's a whole chapter dedicated to this, it was out of this melange of fantasy, commerce, because they were all trying to figure out how to make a business out of it, right? Hubbard would joke to Heinlein, "Hey, I'm Heinlein, or I'm sorry, Campbell," because Campbell was the editor and ran this business. That he would always joke with him, I think the best way to make a living, make a fortune in this country is to start your own religion. And Campbell just kind of wrote it off. And of course, L. Ron Hubbard went on to do just that. So he was working it out. And one of the interesting innovations that they were experimenting with, L. Ron Hubbard and his friends there, has been revived today in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. Today, it's called transcranial stimulation. Look it up. There's all kinds of, I don't know how much money, I don't know, and who the research, and I think probably a lot of military are involved with funding the research, DARPA, right, NATO. But it's called transcranial stimulation. But they were doing it back in the late 20s and 30s. And here's Campbell. This is really early in the book. This is Campbell, who was involved, John Campbell, who was pretty straight otherwise. Because remember, he had a very tormented childhood, and he wanted to regress He wanted to have regressive memories because he couldn't remember anything before his 12th birthday. And I think it was probably because he was sexually abused. So he tried phenobarbital, tried all these different drugs. So it was L. Ron Hubbard that said, hey, let's try this apparatus. And it was something that the neurologist, Jean-Martin Charcot, had devised in his own therapeutic. This is in Paris, of course, that he had devised himself to treat catalepsy or people who were suffering from World War II shell shock, battle fatigue. Right, this is Charcot, the great Charcot, who, by the way, was one of the professors of Freud. Of course, Freud, the egomaniac he is, effaced all the influences that he did have. Charcot being one of them, but one of Charcot's devices was a pyramidal, I guess you would call it a stroboscope, a strobe light. It would flash all these lights there and you peer into it. It's very much like a John Dee, right? Scrying, looking to the mirror, looking in a crystal ball, but it was being done with this stroboscopic effect. And both of them, Campbell and L. Ron Hubbard, went into very, very quickly into an induced state of psychosis. They were mad. In fact, John Campbell thought he was going crazy. He thought he was going insane. And they figured out later from reading the literature that was around that what was happening is these lights were locking into their brain waves, their brain frequencies, right? And that, by the way, is the basis of what today is being called transcranial stimulation. So you see how the continuity of the technology as well as the political agenda from then to now. We see how teledildonics is going to go up. I'm also, since I'm a futurologist myself, right? If they can predict the future, so can I, because I read a lot of the 21st century material that these guys were reading in the early 20th century, and I can draw inferences from it. Just as we're going to have teledildonics, there will be apps on your so-called smartphone that's going to, on demand, not your demand, on the state demand, on the demand of our handlers, the Brave New World. There's going to be an app there that's going to put us into this altered state of consciousness excuse me a second, as L. Ron Hubbard and John W. Campbell learned about early on. Now, just to show you that this was not a one-off, that this was just not unique to this select group of people, if you recall maybe a talk I gave about a year ago, and I talked about James B. Conant, Conant, and one of his grandchildren, Jeanette Conant, wrote a biography of her grandfather. I think it was great-grandfather, great-grandfather, but anyway, she's a lineal descendant of him. He was also the president of Harvard University, right? But guess what his avocation was, James B. Conant. This is from the biography I'm getting. James B. Conant's avocation was what we would call transcranial stimulation. All the fancy guests, the highly educated bankers and intellects of the time, and he later went to help found, by the way, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. This is the same Conant, but he was very much interested in these neural functions as these guys around the Gernsbach, or more appropriately, the Campbellian circle. They were involved in these neurological neurotechnologies, which is what's going on now. And said, but to supplement that or to complement, they're using today in mRNA, and they're using nanotechnology and the rejiggering of the genetic code, so that it doesn't have to be some sort of stimulus that's coming from the outside. It's something that can be controlled within your brain. And I gave the talk on Robin Williams, right? And I'm going to be speaking very shortly to someone who lived in that milieu. She's going to have a lot of stories to share with me, I'm sure. But I have my own theory about the neural triangle that Robin Williams was sucked into, right? So here is another piece of that neuro puzzle that we've been building. And I didn't intend intend that to happen. I'm just pulling on this certain thread, and here we're led back to the old school, the golden age of science fiction. It's more than science fiction. It is science, political science fiction, right? Social psychology, political sociology, pioneered by this man himself. Let's check him out. One Hugo Gernsback. Thank you, Mr. Gernsback. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for bearing with me. I hope I was coherent. I was so excited by pulling all these different threads together and tying them up. And I'll smooth that out. I mean, the tapestry will be more complete, and the design will be more comprehensible as we continue this this adventure together. Again, thank you very much. Onward and upward. Have a great weekend. June is starting off with a great start. All right. Thank you. Bye.